You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hi! Ako si Trisha Aquino, Puma Podcast. You're listening to Teka News. In this episode,
remember that the history of the Bangsamoro is a history of disenfranchisement, displacement, and violence. So kaya naman may mga nag-alsa, kaya naman may mga nag-decide na bumuo at maging miyembro ng mga revolutionary groups is because they themselves felt violence.
isang taon kong trinabaho ang podcast na tinawag naming Balangkas ng Bukas. Framework of the Future. Tungkol to sa kung paano nabubuo ang reforma. And through this, we're able to enjoy the rights, freedoms, and privileges we have today. Sa unang season ng podcast, kasama ang researcher na si Faith Navarro at ang audio editor na si Carl Sayat, tinignan ko ang paglikha ng Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. Pati na rin ang pagpasa ng Bangsamoro Organic Law or BOL at ang pagbuo ng kapayapaan sa pagitan ng gobyerno ng Pilipinas at ng Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Ito ang natutunan ko. It's been 9 years since the signing of the Comprehensive Agreement on the Bangsamoro or CAB under the term of the late President Benigno Aquino III. Ang CAB ay ang final peace pact sa pagitan ng gobyerno at ng MILF. At 5 taon na ang lumipas mula ng pirmahan ni President Rodrigo Duterte ang BOL. Most of those years were spent in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the middle of the health crisis, the region's governing body, the Bangsamoro Transition Authority, made themselves felt to their constituents in huge part by the provision of ayuda. Maaaring hindi ito big deal para sa mga taong taga-Maynila katulad ko, na sanay makakita ng relief goods delivered by the truckload tuwing may sakuna. But talking to at least 3 people for the podcast made me realize how rare this was for those from Muslim Mindanao. Sabi ng co-host ko sa podcast, si Siti Fariza Ismail, ito raw ang unang beses na nakatikim siya ng ganong klaseng tulong mula sa gobyerno.
Talagang malaking dagok ang pandemic. Pero mas naramdaman namin yung galaw at pagpapahalaga ng mga namumuno ng BARMM kasi through the Bangsamoro Agency Task Force on COVID-19, the Bangsamoro government put in place the necessary measures to contain the virus spread and meet the basic needs of its constituents. Naalala ko pa, first time naming makakita dito ng relief packs na may mga sabon, 1 dozen coffee packs, milk, canned goods, noodles, and many more. Talagang nakakawindang kasi palagi silang nagbibigay, hindi lang isang beses. Nakatanggap din kami ng cash assistance.
Siti is a Bangsamoro woman who volunteers for an organization that strives to make the value of the peace process understood by her fellow youth. United Voices for Peace Network or UVPN enables young Bangsamoros to participate in good governance and make their suggestions for positive change heard.
We at UVPN want to support the gains of the peace process. If, when they were young, our elders took up arms and are today fighting for peace slowly but surely, it's our job to keep the good work going. It's important to remember that the separatist groups in our communities began with young people who were dissatisfied with the lot they had been handed in life. They had experienced a lot of pain, poverty, and injustice, and they wanted to make a change. They genuinely wanted reform. They wanted better lives for themselves and their families. Today we believe that we will be able to achieve this through BARMM.
Her elders who took up arms? They had tried to forge peace with the Philippine government for 17 long years and ultimately succeeded. Bahagi na sila ng Bangsamoro Transition Authority ngayon. Ang chief minister nito ay si MILF Chairman Alhaj Murad Ibrahim. And apart from surviving the pandemic, the leader's top priorities are education, health, and social services. They're also working on a semblance of normalcy for hundreds of thousands of residents who were displaced 6 years ago by the siege of Marawi, where government forces battled against the extremist Maute group for 5 long months. But let's take a step back. Now that we've traced the beginnings of the BOL and the BARMM, and checked in on what has kept its leadership busy these days, let's think about how it took almost 2 decades to get to where we are today. And those 2 decades, and even hundreds of years before that, Muslim Mindanao had already suffered violence, displacement, and neglect from the government. While poverty incidence has improved in BARMM, from 54% of families being poor in 2018 to only 29% in 2021, historically, poverty has been much higher in the region compared to other parts of the country, especially the capital.
Remember that the history of the Bangsamoro is a history of disenfranchisement, displacement, and violence. So kaya naman may mga nag-alsa, kaya naman may mga nag-decide na bumuo at maging miyembro ng mga revolutionary groups is because they themselves felt violence.
Yan si Minister of Parliament Ana Basman. Kinausap ko rin siya para sa Balangkas ng Bukas. Bago siya maging mambabatas, she was part of the government negotiating panel that was working towards peace with their MILF counterparts.
So yung mga injustices na na-feel from state agents, yun yung naging mukha. So anytime na makakaramdam ulit ng threat of that breaking of confidence, nagkakaroon ng violence. So kita naman natin yan. Sinabi ko, nagkaroon ng Zamboanga siege, nagkaroon ng itong very recently, yung sa nangyari sa Marawi. So fragile yung the peace that we are keeping and that we are building.
MP Basman talked to me from Cotabato City, the seat of the BARMM government.
Importante na nobody sits on their laurels. Nobody feels confident in our situation now. Like siguro 2 decades ago, 1 decade ago, some people would not feel comfortable living in this area. But we now, we feel na in the past years, in the past decade, madami even foreigners, even ambassadors are able to visit the region. Even heads of state are able to visit the region without much fuss, beyond the necessary fuss, I would say. So, malaking bagay yung ganun, malaking leap yun na in terms of security. But we cannot be blind to the fact na kailangan actively natin tong pinoprotektahan. And for me, that means protecting the confidence of the people in the peace process. So for as long as people feel na itong avenue na to is effective in the redress of their grievances, nobody will be attracted to joining or participating in violent activities.
I heard something similar from Professor Miriam Coronel Ferrer. She was the head of the government negotiating panel and would end up becoming the first woman chief peace negotiator in the world to sign a final peace agreement with the rebel group. I asked her, 4 years after BARMM was founded, what should we be looking at as a nation? Ano ang dapat nating binabantayan?
Good governance, number one, because diyan ka madadali. Remember, may election.
In 2025, the people of BARMM will finally be able to elect their own regional officials.
And looking at the global experience, no, hindi laging nanalo yung nag-sign ng peace agreement sa first election after the signing of the peace agreement. So for me, the greatest challenge for the MILF is to avoid tendencies to be exclusivist. Kailangan inclusive sila to really practice meritocracy and then talagang bantayan din nila yung ranks nila for any abuses that might happen. And then they have to work with the young people as well. Pag hindi talaga na-appreciate ng next generation yung efforts ng MILF leadership ngayon, babalik ka na naman dun sa cycle na some of them will be radicalized. So ngayon, ang pinaka-hole na pwedeng puntahan ng mga disenchanted young people is precisely yung mga violent extremists. And that's a big challenge also for the MILF. I mean, it's everybody's responsibility, pero since they're the government authority there, malaki dapat yung kanilang effort, especially to bring over the youth to the same desires for peace, good governance, lahat yan, no? Everything that they wanted as part of their struggle, but now through peaceful means.
Tayong mga ordinaryong mamamayan, anong pwede nating gawin? I realized while doing this podcast, while talking to people I never would have before, given my Catholic upbringing in Manila, that it can start with a simple yet powerful act of listening. Ang dami kong naintindihan. Nakita ko yung pinanggagalingan ng mga kausap ko na taga-BARMM dahil nakinig ako o dahil pinili kong makinig sa kanila. Narealize ko rin na napakahalagang bahagi ito ng peace process. That back and forth between the government and MILF negotiators, that was a lot of talking and hearing each other out and making the other feel that they're heard. Listening to our Bangsamoro brothers and sisters made me think and made me ashamed. Kasi gaano kadalas man natin silang pinakinggan itong mga nakaraang dekada? How much pain did we acknowledge? There's a Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission where representatives from the government and MILF peace panels, along with international experts, listened to over 3,000 people from Mindanao talk about their grievances spanning decades. They were farmers, fishers, wives, teachers, spiritual leaders, government officials, members of the security sector, combatants from the MILF and the Moro National Liberation Front, all telling stories that reflected historical injustices, human rights violations, and marginalization through land dispossession. There's a report on that on peace.gov.ph. That's the website of the Office of the Presidential Advisor on Peace, Reconciliation, and Unity. It's definitely worth a read, and going through it was like hearing the voices of all of these respondents. If we are to combat radicalism, if we are to heal wounds, if we are to reconcile with a group of people that has been marginalized for so long, it all begins with listening to their stories. Sabi nga ng history professor na nakausap ko, si Sir Termizi Abdullah ng Mindanao State University sa Marawi, importante ang kasaysayan sa proseso ng paghilom. We need to know and face these historical injustices so that we can have empathy for them and be in solidarity with them as they journey as BARMM. Muli ako si Trisha Aquino, Podcast. You're listening to Teka Teka News. This episode was produced by myself. It was edited by Pidoy Blanco. If you want to hear more of what we talked about today, just search for Balangkas ng Bukas on your favorite podcast app. Balangkas ng Bukas, Stories of Major Policy Reforms is a podcast of youth leadership for democracy or Youth-Led, a project of the Asia Foundation and the United States Agency for International Development, powered by Podcast with the support of the United Voices for Peace Network. Thanks for listening.